Scott here. I want to talk about healthy narcissism. So, this term has been misused. I've seen it be overused, misused, narcissism. Okay? While on one hand, it's really important that we can identify abusive behavior and not accept that, to put boundaries around that, to not expose ourselves to that. On the other hand, most often when people are talking about narcissism, they're sort of doing so in a reductionistic way, meaning that the full complexity of the term isn't really fully present in that. There's no nuance in it. And typically, we're talking about someone else's narcissism in this form. The reality is, if we look at Heinz Kohut, who is the founder of self-psychology, or what became self-psychology, his work on narcissism is typically left out of these conversations, at least the ones that I see on social media. And it's really unfortunate that it is, because in his practice and his theory, Kohut understands narcissism as a healthy, normal part of all of our development, that it's a process of development that each of us go through and that carries with us on an emotional level. And in our childhood, if we're not getting the narcissistic needs, which I'll go over in a second, met, then what happens is we develop a kind of wounding there, a pain that then becomes calloused. We have to sort of cover up from. There's not blood flow there, so we have to kind of tense around it, and this turns into, or has the potential to turn into, more of a classic, what people associate with narcissism, the behaviors, the classic behaviors. Okay, so the idea though is that it's not that someone's either narcissistic or they're not, is that we have a spectrum to the degree which we've been impacted and developed patterns in relationship to what we're calling narcissism. Let me say that one more time. So it's not that we either are or we aren't. It's that we each have had experiences of misattunement that have become then internalized. And we've incorporated that into our approach to relationships. And so when it comes to that, we have on one end of the spectrum what we would call narcissistic personality disorder, which is the most intense expression of that, where the patterns are so pervasive that someone has difficulty seeing anything outside of those patterns. And then we have, on the other end of the spectrum, that we all have certain narcissistic needs and expressions that could manifest as behavior if we're not able to be conscious of them and learn how to validate them ourselves. So this idea that someone else is narcissist and we shouldn't, we have to distance ourselves and associate narcissism with like evil or something like that. It's very limited. And if we throw the baby out with the bathwater, at least if we take Kohut's theory into account, it's going to be very unfortunate to us and potentially harmful to us. So let's look just a little bit about what narcissistic needs are, why they're relevant to all of us. Okay, so Kohut identified really 3 needs, narcissistic needs, for a child. What he called mirroring needs, what he called idealization needs, what he called twinship needs. Mirroring needs are the need for a child to have their presence, their reality, their significance, and their power reflected back to them. So meaning if we come to a child, if a child is, let's say that child is having, is really angry, right? And we go to them and we say, "Oh, I see, Johnny, you're really angry." This is an example of mirroring. Alternatively, if we go to a child and they're angry and we say, "Johnny, you shouldn't be angry. Stop your whining. Stop this. Da 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 da." If we come at them with that energy, what's going to happen is they're going to start feeling like their anger is wrong, shouldn't be happening. And they're going to internalize that over time. And what happens then is now every time they experience anger, they have part of them that tells themselves, "Oh, this shouldn't be happening. And now I have to compensate for it because I didn't get this need met for mirroring." And if over time that crystallizes into my identity, now it becomes, I'm not allowed to be angry. And so my anger has to come out in subversive ways, which could be being critical of others. I mean, this is a general example, but it serves the purpose well. Mirroring also is a way that we know we are accepted and valued. It's part of our survival need as human beings to be accepted and valued. We evolved in community. The species that we're in, it did not evolve in isolation. We evolved in community. We want to be accepted. It's in our DNA. It's part of our survival. And so the mirroring need is a way that children feel soothed. And as adults, we bring that into our relationship. We want to feel powerful in the sense, well, I'll get to that. We want to feel accepted. We want to feel like we're important to someone. And that doesn't make us bad or wrong. It's totally understandable. Now, sometimes if we're not aware of that we can look for that in ways that aren't going to allow us to achieve it. For example, if we feel valued by seeking out relationships with people who actually don't care about us, but because they like us, it allows us to feel on some level soothed, at least temporarily, that pattern is going to be harmful for us in the long run. If we're not aware and conscious of the actual hurt that comes from, the narcissistic injury that comes from, and able to be with the part of ourselves that needs to feel valued and recognize that inside of us, we might just keep looking for it in places that hurt us. And so that's one reason why narcissism is really important, that we understand it as part of us, part of our own lives, not just some mean person over there who is abusive. No, it's part of our own lives too. So let's talk a little bit about the power piece. Mirroring as a reflection of power. Well, children need to know that they're powerful, meaning that they can take up space, that they have their own power. They also need to recognize their limits, and parents really need to model limits to children and be firm with them as well. And at the same time, to do so not at the expense of allowing the child to recognize their own power in a healthy, appropriate way. And by power here, we mean like, hey, I can take up space. Yes, I can be angry. Yes, wow, I have this capacity to walk, right? These things, we want to celebrate these things. That's part of what generates healthy self-esteem. If we don't get acknowledged for our strengths, what we're good at, right? What are we going to do? We're not going to recognize them. We're going to be focused on what we're not good at. And so many people that come to therapy, myself included, we're really good at focusing on what we're bad at. Really good. And that can still be connected to narcissism. Now, often we think about narcissism as being someone who's incapable of seeing what they're bad at, that they only think they're good at. Well, no, that's not entirely true. I mean, that is, again, one end of the spectrum. But the emphasis and focus on how I'm so bad at things or so critical is still connected to the same kind of wounding. Do you see what I'm saying? Two different expressions of very much the same kind of wounding. So it's important that when it comes to feeling empowered or recognizing our power, having that be reflected, it means that we recognize that we're worthy of taking up space. We're worthy of asking for what we want. This is healthy narcissism. An expression of unhealthy or narcissistic wounding would be, I don't feel I'm worthy, and so I'm not going to ask for what I want. The other person should just know what I want. And I'm going to get really, really mad at them if they don't know. I mean, this is an example. And so having a sense of our power allows us to say, I can take up space with this. I deserve to be heard and listened to for my feelings. I don't have to give up my experience in order to caretake someone else. Okay, let's talk a little bit about idealization. So I'm going to do a quick representation of this because I could spend a lot of time on it. And if you find it's useful and you want to learn more about it, let me know. I'll do a video dedicated to it. Idealization is a way that children learn to protect themselves from anxiety, we could say. Because when we're children, we depend so heavily on our parents. We need to believe that they have our best interests in mind. We need to believe that they're very powerful. It's an example is the idea that my dad could beat up your dad kind of thing. Like, we need to believe that our dad could actually beat up your dad, because that's part of what allows us to feel secure and safe. And if we struggle to do that, or we don't get that need met, we can't, in a way, our parents are hurting us, right? If the idealization need is, we could say, decompensated, meaning that when we try to idealize, we're also getting hurt, that we're getting this message that, oh gosh, dad isn't so good. So now we have to split. Part of us feels that dad is really good, and we need to hold on to that. And another part of us is aware that, oh God, this hurts. This is not good, and it's painful, and I don't know. Something doesn't feel right, right? So we try to maintain the idealization as this protective way for us emotionally to feel secure. And another part of us, if we're being hurt, and then we kind of, part of us, that just doesn't go away, even though we need to protect ourselves in this way, this gets stored. And maybe we start, and when we're adults, we start getting really enraptured by idealizing others. We get really preoccupied with trying to find the perfect, right? Trying to find the perfect partner, trying to find the perfect therapist, trying to find the perfect friend, trying to find the perfect career, trying to be the perfect person. Maybe we idealize ourselves. That would be more of the far end of the spectrum of narcissism. Oh, I'm the best. I'm perfect in this way. I can't do any wrong. Or maybe we project that onto others. Oh, they're so great. They're the best. And what's important to note here is that this process is not bad per se. We don't want to approach it like, oh, this shouldn't be happening. I should do this. This is shameful, or we want to be aware of it, conscious of it. idealization is a normal, natural part of who we are. We do it, especially early on in, like, for example, romantic relationships. It's so much a part of that first stage of romantic relationships. It allows us to open up to someone. We start thinking about all their good qualities. We start appreciating them and noticing all the strengths. It's just the problem is, eventually, we start noticing the things we don't like. And so if we're stuck and holding on to the ideal about it, well, it's going to make that way more challenging when we start noticing the things we don't like. And we might start comparing that person to an ideal. Oh, but you used to be like this. Or, oh, but you're like, I thought you were like this. Can't you just be more like this? Right? And that's conflict. That's us being attached to an ideal about someone. And if we're not able to walk that back and become aware of it and understand what's underneath that for us, what need we're trying to have be met, what emotions that are deep underneath that we're carrying into us, then we're likely going to continue to create conflict. We're going to compare other people to our ideal, compare ourselves to the ideal. And the result is going to be internal conflict, external conflict. Internal conflict, external conflict. Now, I'm not saying we can ever avoid conflict, right? I'm talking about adding layers into conflict. So it's really relevant and important that we understand this process and connect with the vulnerability that exists below it. And I could go on more about idealization as a big part of my research and the theoretical research I've done. However, let's jump into twinship a little bit before we wrap up. I know this is getting kind of long here. So twinship is the need to feel that someone shares a similar experience with us, right? That we can sort of see something about ourselves reflected in someone else, that we could share this quality of connection. And so much of our systems are built, as I said earlier, on this belonging, right? And so it's so important that we feel we can share certain elements, that we can have our experience reflected and valued in that way. And so I think that particular need, when we're moving into relationship, we can really appreciate the qualities of twinship, the things that we share, the commonalities, the way that someone else reflects our own interests and qualities, strengths, and how we might also reflect theirs. I think where this can get tricky, if we apply it into a relational context, is if I start thinking that someone should be more like me, which I think on some level we all think to a degree. And this is an element of that narcissism. I wish they were just more like me, right? Well, yeah. That to me is sort of the other edge of twinship, right? Is we're also comparing ourselves to the ideal and wanting other people to reflect that in a way that maybe isn't fully understanding of each person's distinct expression, personal expression, okay? Which isn't to say that we're bad or wrong because we have that element of narcissism inside of us. It's to say that we want to hold that gently and notice if we start comparing people in that way. And also having an avenue to get those twinship needs met. So what that might look like is like, hey, if we're in a relationship, it might not be useful to expect our partner to be able to meet all those twinship needs. I think that's a lot of pressure to put on a partner. That sometimes they might be able to express some of those twinship needs, which is great. That's important. I think that's can be a foundation of connection in a relationship. However, if we look to them for all our twinship needs, it's going to likely contribute to conflict. So we need to have other ways, other relationships where we can feel held and we can have that reflected back to us, those qualities. So that way it doesn't all fall. It's like if we think of pressure as force times, and I'm not a physicist, but if we think of pressure as force times area, right? If we put it all in one relationship, that's a lot of force times. The area is small and there's a lot of force there, so it's gonna have a kind of an impact in that way. But if we can sort of diffuse that need into multiple relationships, then that can be held more fully. And I wouldn't say it means that we have to have a huge social community per se. It means that we find and we connect with people who really can understand where we're coming from and where we can share qualities and interests in a way that supports us in feeling like we're connected and that we belong. Okay? All right. Thank you very, very much for watching. Really appreciate that. I hope this video is useful for you. I know this topic is really important to me. So if you have questions about it, feel free to reach out. I will make follow-up videos. I think this is an important topic and I'd be happy to. Okay, take care.